Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you. I'm Lynn West, and along with the rest of the Westminster events team, we just really a very warm welcome here today. We're so glad you joined us. We have I think what will be an interesting and stimulating program for you today. And we appreciate that you took the time and trouble to come out in this wet and rainy weather. We know that that was a choice you made, and we hope and trust that you will find the discussion that you came for interesting and stimulating because it is such an important and timely issue. A few things to mention before we get started. First, if you haven't already, please do silence your cell phones. And also, if you noticed on the signs on the way in, we are very fortunate to have a professional photographer who happens to be Ukrainian here with us today. And so we ask, if you don't mind, to please keep your cell phones out of sight so she can get the best photos possible. And if you would prefer to opt out of any photos that we might choose to put on our website or on social media, please let my colleague Karen Halsey know. Karen is right back there and raising her hand. So just to know what to expect from the format today, we will start with 45 minutes of discussion between our two speakers, followed by 20 minutes of audience Q&A, and then a half hour for the reception, which you are all invited to afterward. While we're during the discussion, if you think of questions that you would like to ask, please write them down on the little note card you were given as you came in, and when the time comes, pass them to the center aisle. Our greeters will collect them and bring them up. And I promise we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. But if we run out of time, just know that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions in person yourself if you can attend the reception, which our speakers have very kindly agreed to do. One final note. I have been asked a number of times how this event came to be. So I just wanted to share with you all that this program is part of a new and we think an innovative initiative that Westminster has agreed to host events for the community like this, workshops, speakers, other kinds of meetings. So we are just pleased that you all chose to join us today. And if you're interested in finding out about future programs, you're welcome to go to westminstereventsmarin.org. So with that, I am going to turn it over. Paula, let me explain. So Paula Reynolds, our great friend, is a community organizer and longtime resident of Mill Valley, who we're so happy to have back in the role of interviewer because she did such a great job the last time we had her here. And she is going to introduce Natalia to you. So Paula, let me turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Can everyone hear me? Very much appreciate being part of this speaker series, and I'd like to give a huge shout out to the village of volunteers it took to make this happen. And I love your mission here at Westminster Events to help us all learn, grow, and connect in this beautiful space that we hope the community will become familiar with and use in other ways. So thank you very much. Natalia, a very warm welcome at a very difficult time to you. I'd also like to welcome your family. We have Miroslav, your father, Maria, your mother, who has also baked some delicious Ukrainian treats for us for the reception. We also, your husband Juan is here. There, right in front of me. Thank you. And Rostik, your nephew, who has just come over from Ukraine last May and now is a student at College of Marin. So thank you very much for bringing your family as well.
Thank you.
So Natalia, I'm going to introduce you to our audience by way of my first question, starting with your incredibly impressive personal story. You're a very successful entrepreneur of an international software company with over 1,000 employees in 3 continents. You speak 5 languages. You have a master's in business from Stanford University, and you're raising 3 children here in Tiburon. What brought you to America and what inspired you to be an entrepreneur?
Can you hear me? Can you? I think I have told that story already several times, but it's an inspiring story. My grandmother lived with us, and I grew up in Soviet Union, and Soviet Union was really brutal Russian occupation. And my grandmother, during the Second World War, did not escape to the West. Many Ukrainians did, and many in our family actually were able to flee. And she was telling me stories at night, you know, like I tell my kids now. And she would tell me about this land called United States of America, where people were free, and they enjoyed all these benefits of being free and doing wonderful things and doing great things for themselves and their family. And I always thought in my dreams, you know, I would like to get to that blessed land, because that was my idea of America, that blessed land, that shiny hill, this shiny city on the hill. And at the same time, I lived sort of a double life, because I was going to a Soviet school, and all of the teachers were showering on us Soviet propaganda. And the teachers themselves did not believe in that propaganda, but they had to do it, because if they didn't do it, they would lose their job, they would lose their ability to progress in their careers. So I always kind of was in that double life, right? One thing you hear at school, and then you come home and your grandmother tells you a different thing. But of course I trusted my grandmother. So for me to imagine that I would one day come to the United States when it was really Iron Curtain, right? It was probably easier for me to imagine that I would one day fly as an astronaut to the moon or Mars than to come to the United States. That was an impossible thing at that time, in the 80s, when I was going to school. And then, of course, the wall came down, and then the Ukraine became independent. But even before Ukraine became independent, I went to school in Moscow, because that's where the best students at that time went. And in '91, the first delegation, I believe it was one of the first delegation of Americans, came to that institution where I was studying, and it was professors, business people. It was called People to People, when, you know, just Soviet Union was opening up. And I met a professor at the little get-together when he came to talk to the students. And I had a chance to speak with him, and he said, well, would you like to come to the United States to study? And, you know, for me to come to the United States to study, as I said, it was easier to imagine that, you know, I would be flying somewhere in outer space than actually had such an opportunity. Of course, and he was really instrumental in getting me the scholarship at the college. I came initially to Oregon, to a community college. I spent there, and I lived with his family. I had room and board. And when I got there, he got me a job. That's basically the story how I came as a student to the United States. And I also have to tell you this, when I landed in New York City, because I came to New York, and I came out of the plane, and believe it or not, but the sky was bluer, the grass was greener, and the sun was shining in a different way. You know, I got here, I got to this blessed land, and I know there are many immigrants here and refugees, and it is really a land of opportunity. I don't know of other immigrants who didn't find their spot under the sun in this country, and it continues to be so. And for the recent refugees that are here, I know how tough it might be in the beginning to start from scratch when you leave everything behind. But there are abundant opportunities in this country and wonderful, generous people who are here to help you to get that in new life.
Thank you, and that's a wonderful segue to your equally impressive humanitarian efforts since the 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea. You co-founded Hromada, which I understand was initially focused on promoting cultural, education, and charitable activities among Ukrainian refugees all over the world. What does Hromada mean, and what does it mean to you?
Hromada means an intelligent group of people who work together, self-govern themselves to achieve common goals. So it's if you translate it into English, the closest translation would be community. And the reason why I co-founded Hromada, it was actually in 2017, because I met a couple of like-minded people. One of them was Lesia, and she wanted to start a Ukrainian newspaper. And there was no Ukrainian newspaper on the west coast of the United States, not even in Northern California. And that's how the newspaper started. We started the first copy in 2017. We did events, and I'll demonstrate a little bit later into the program some of the latest headlines that our newspaper was highlighting. But the thought behind the newspaper was to unite the community, give a voice of Ukrainian Americans, a voice to Ukrainian Americans diaspora here, and just form again community around Hromada.
And how have your efforts been transformed since the invasion almost a year ago?
Of course, everything has changed since the invasion, right? It has changed me as a person going through that ordeal. Yeah, I'll talk about that. But, it's, and I can talk about that personal experience or what we endured, but it's not unique to me. Mm-hmm. I think it's for pretty much all American Ukrainian diaspora here when the when the 24th of February, when the full-scale invasion was announced, we were in shock, complete shock. I did not believe till the very last moment that something like this could be happening in our date and time. We were in complete disarray, despair. Nobody believed that Ukraine was going to stand. I honestly thought, I have to confess in the beginning, I thought Ukraine is done with. I thought, it will be Russian occupation yet again. And it's just looked very, very grave. We would go to the Israelis, with my family, and I would see the faces of people, and I've never seen such despair, and such faces were just gray from angst, from anguish, from pain. And, I saw a similar face actually on Sean Penn, because he traveled to Ukraine several times and he was giving interviews. And in the beginning of the war, when I saw him, when you look at him, I'm like, oh, I know that face. It's the face full of despair, something horrible is about to happen, and you just do not know how to deal with it, right? So I personally couldn't sleep for 2 weeks. My wonderful neighbors, some of them are here, were reaching out, sending me texts, chocolates, and I actually couldn't even gather myself to respond to them. It took me even some time to come to that point. Of course, we all kind of had to gather ourselves together, because we were on a mission then. Like, what can we do? It just cannot be that this is happening. And I know.
Tell us what you've done since then.
And so the first immediate thing for us was, we knew that there was a huge humanitarian crisis. And people probably in the audience remember the pictures that were pouring in. Women, families fleeing with their small children crying. The images on the train station, they were even contrasting them, picture in Kyiv on a train station and London during the Second World War. And what we did, we said, okay, there's this huge humanitarian crisis is looming. There were people that will be displaced, children, women. We got to get them help. So we started a fundraising effort just to help the refugees and children and women. And we have to say that people were very generous. All of my neighbors contributed, and some of them are here. I want to acknowledge the donations. Most of our donations came from Americans, as well as from Ukrainians. It's understood, but most of them in small donations, $50, $100, $500. We did get a significant donation from one foundation, and in the beginning, we were sending money daily to multiple organizations because people were turning to us. And we had those networks of the volunteer organization from before. Because when we started the newspaper very early on, we also wanted to have the charitable component to the organization, a charitable cause. And as you probably know, the war, this mass invasion that started in February last year, The war was going on since 2014, when Putin stole Crimea, and when he rolled in his tanks into eastern Ukraine, and there was a conflict in Donbass, and there were children who were orphaned as a result. As of January of 2022, before the conflict, there were about 3,000 children whose parents have died in that conflict. And we were raising money for Christmas over the holidays and sending $50 per child to these families. I think in 7 regions out of 21, we were able to cover the kids. So we had the foundation, we knew the people, we knew the volunteers on the ground, and then we also made new connections. Because people were reaching out to us, people were even emailing us. And in the beginning, for example, just to give you an idea for what the money was used for, Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv was under heavy bombardment, and people were leaving that city. So we were sending money to a nonprofit organization in the city of Dnipro, and you probably have heard about Dnipro also, because 3 weeks there was a horrible terrorist act done when the residential building was bombarded and 45 people died. But at that point, we were sending money to that volunteering organization. They were sending trucks full with food, water to Kharkiv to give it to the people on the streets, whoever needed it. And then they would load the trucks with people, women and children, and they would bring them back to Dnipro. We had volunteers who were asking us money for food, for elderly people who couldn't evacuate,
And even on a more personal level, you have 500 or so employees still
Right.
of your company in Ukraine. How are they faring?
Well, in the beginning, as I said, it was chaos, right? It was horrific. I really had to pull myself together, to come to work. I didn't want to wake up in the morning, but I had to, because I had so many people relying on me and taking decisions. So we used to have 600 people in Ukraine. Now we only have 500. 100 of them fled. Many of them we had people in eastern, central Ukraine. Many of them have left for the West because and we have a lot of men, we are a high-tech company, so we have a lot of men in our company. They could not leave the country, but women could. And I also have to say that 8 of my colleagues, of people who worked for the company, are now in the military, fighting. They were there since day one, and we support them. We support them financially, and we're waiting for their return as soon as possible. But of course, we were helping our employees, helping them with giving them monetary assistance to relocate. And I would say within 2 months, in the beginning it was extremely difficult, but within 2 months, people have things have settled. People moved to the West. Many people moved to Europe. Some came to the United States. But let me tell you, it was a very difficult time, and still is. Jamie's here, and I'm going to talk about Jamie a little bit in the program, because she's done a wonderful job with refugees here, and she has a nonprofit that does a tremendous work for refugees who come here to this country. But I remember she said to me once we met, and she said, I was watching these movies about Second World War, and I could not understand how people let that happen. And it's happening again. And it really struck me what she said. Yeah, because...
Well, and if I can ask you just sort of a big policy question, and then I'd like to talk some more about the Marin-based support, but what do you hope and want the U.S. and the international community to do that it isn't already doing in Ukraine, and why? And I think the why it matters to Americans. And also, how important are the recent U.S. decisions to provide long-range missiles and tanks?
Well, the fight of Ukraine is not just the fight for Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and for their freedom. It's really for the universal values that we as Americans cherish, such as justice, human dignity, and freedom, of course. If in the unlikely, and I'm an optimist, but imagine the world if Ukraine were to lose and to be occupied by Russia, what that world will look like. First of all, it will change the international security order. It's in U.S. national interests that a bully, that a criminal regime like Putin does not succeed in its bloodthirsty aspirations. Not just the U.S., but the entire United West, civilized world and free world, I think recognizes what is at stake here. There were a set of rules that were set up after the Second World War, after the horrible never again, now that never again has happened, the countries have agreed, these are the borders and these are the new rules that we abide to. And those were blatantly violated by Putin's Russia. So that means if in the unlikely event that Putin were to win, that would give the green light to other dictators out there. That would give again them the chance, I can use brutal force to achieve my goals. Mm-hmm. So the importance of this, there are so many stories behind this fight. It's freedom versus obedience. Yes. It's democracy versus dictatorship. And Russia was just recently already on that index put on the dictatorship index. It's justice versus injustice. These are the values that Americans stand for, that are written in the Declaration of Independence. And I will never remember Sean Penn, I'm going to refer to him one more time, but he was saying, we as Americans have to do something about it, because if we do not stand up for the values that Ukraine is defending for the entire free world, we're going to lose the sight of our flag. And that really struck me.
Well, and you're clearly very passionate, and I know we're going to have a lot of questions about the big picture, and I want to savor those a little bit, but I do want to move to a more sort of personal and local level just for a few minutes. You mentioned Jamie Coulter, and I'd love it if you could talk about the Marin-based initiatives that are helping Ukrainian refugees here, and perhaps you can acknowledge some of the folks in the audience that you'd like us to know or hear.
I already mentioned Jamie, and I want Jamie to stand up. She really does a wonderful job. She has no connection to Ukraine, but early on into the conflict, we connected, actually through my husband, because she put an ad on Next Door Neighbor. We connected with Jamie, and we cooperated. Whereas our organization, we send these mini grants to Ukraine, specifically who people needed the most. Jamie's organization effort focused on the refugees, specifically here in Marin. And I believe she helped more than 15 families already, maybe even higher count. And she provides them with assistance, legal assistance, with finding apartments, cars, jobs for them. So she really does wonderful work. And for people who want to specifically help out the refugees and family that have come here, I really want you to talk to Jamie. And Jamie, maybe you have your guests here, right? Maybe you could also acknowledge them.
We have, first of all, so many volunteers who have done equally as much or more than me. So I would love, I think we're all going to start out, but whoever, like Allison and Elsie here, or don't get stand, and then you could just, thanks so much. Started a program at another church in Simmerfeld that's taken in a lot of refugees and Ukrainians who've come here and passed through their program and help them as well to get into the next step and things are going really amazing. And then we have a lot of Ukrainian families here who some of them have just arrived in the last week or two, some of them have been here for longer. So if you guys would just stand, this is Ksenia and Christina, who have just arrived. They were here about a month ago, and Christina also ran a refugee camp in Warsaw, which is, I find so amazing. She's very young, and good charge, and really spent many months there. And then we also have Ksenia, who is here with her
Thank you, Jamie, and we hope you'll stay and everyone will have a chance to talk to you. Ah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So Natalia, what does Ramada need most now for both local and Ukraine-based humanitarian work? And how can we here today help financially, politically, or otherwise?
That's a great question. And I think each one of us can do something in this situation, because I met many Americans and they say, well, what can we do? You know, there's not that much that we can do, but yes, we can do, and on so many levels. One is advocacy, and we've done a lot of that through our newspaper. If you go to our website, you can see there's call for action. Call your local representative, call your senator, write to Biden administration. And the demand now is on two levels. One, give Ukraine weapons that they ask for. There is no magic behind it. The war, the military science, it's math, basically. And the head of the Ukrainian army, who's now so courageously, who became a hero and leading the Ukrainian military forces, he gave this formula. What Ukraine needs to win, and to win means just to get the Russians out of their territory, and they occupy 20% of the territory of Ukraine. So it's 300 tanks that they need, 670 infantry vehicles, and 500 howitzers. And now they also need airplanes. So it was a lot of optimism. We waited so much, going back to your previous question, for the tanks, because it was critical for the Ukrainians to get it. That decision was made already. Tanks are making their way to Ukraine now. But they need military planes. And that's where it's still, you know, and there were so many no's that we went through, if you remember, in the beginning of the war. This was not, because that was going to be escalation. We're not going to give that because that's going to be escalation. Or we are not, you know, and not this thing or another thing. Finally, this thing. Remember, we were fighting for SWIFT to isolate Russia, for sanctions. Slowly, all of these things were coming in. But now it's give Ukraine the planes, give them the tools that they ask for, and to finish this horrendous, barbaric war. So that's on one level. Writing to the elected representatives and asking for more weapons for Ukraine. But the other one, very important, is to demand, also write to your elected officials, that Russia is recognized as a state sponsor of terrorism. Because they find ways to evade, and this was our July edition of the newspaper, where we had that headline. Russia's finding ways, as always, to circumvent the sanctions. And putting them on the list as state sponsor of terrorism, it's really that hammer that will come down, that will close all the loopholes, further isolate Russia on the international stage, and will basically stop the financing of this horrendous war. We're asking for that. There are laws that are in the Senate and in the House, have not been introduced. So go to our website, look at that. You know, if they receive so many phone calls, if they receive so many letters, the pendulum just might swing, and this important legislation may happen. It also will allow U.S. to transfer the funds of the Russian Federation, and there are a lot of them held in the Federal Reserve now, to Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine. Right now, there's no legal ground to transfer them. They froze them, but they cannot use them. The other thing that could be done, of course, is humanitarian aid. Right. So we obviously like to get funds, because then we can send them to whoever's asking us for what people need. But the other way to help, if you have the venue, we've done multiple concerts, fundraisers. That's, you know, if you have a venue that you could give to us, that will plus. And then, of course, for the local refugees, there is GEMI, and you could donate furniture, cars, help these people find jobs. So on so many levels, each one can contribute.
That's wonderful. And I just should mention that there are flyers out in the reception area when we're finished here, and a lot more information about your website, which is fantastic. You make it very easy to get engaged, so thank you. Looking again at the global picture, what is your vision for post-war Ukraine, and are you hopeful? And where do you see the signs of hope and courage in Ukraine?
We have to be hopeful, right? Because it's very hard, if not impossible, to go on if you're not hopeful. So there was it's a big emotional roller coaster for us. When Kherson was liberated, when they stepped away from Kyiv and other regions that they occupied, there was a lot of optimism. Now it's also a time of big worry and concern, because apparently Russia is planning another offensive that is coming up in February, and that's why it's so critical that this aid, lethal weapon aid, gets there sooner than later to stop that counteroffensive. But of course, I have hope. My hope comes from just seeing so many people who think about this, who worry about this, who want to contribute, who really understand the magnitude of what's happening. And this is the greatest conflict, war, I think, that we probably witnessed. I will dare to say that in our lifetime. Obviously, it's the biggest since the Second World War. It's horrific in terms of destruction that it has done to Ukraine, where 12 million people out of 40 million people became refugees, whether abroad or internal. So I really see lots of these local hromadas coming together and willing to help, and the big international support, and that gives you optimism. The other thing, obviously, is hope, is the spirit of Ukrainian people. You know, that's the biggest hope. I remember those times when my colleague at work was saying, oh, well, how much longer Kyiv going to stand? A week, 2 weeks? And we talked to a general just recently, and we said, well, how is it possible? You were outnumbered by people, by weaponry. How did it happen? And he said it was really miraculous. But the miraculous was actually the spirit of Ukrainian people to fight and not to give in. And Zelensky embodies that spirit of Ukrainian people, and that's what gives me optimism. Of course, the tanks give me a lot of optimism. Yes. And if Ukraine were to get planes, that would give me even more optimism, and I think it's probably heading in that direction. So, we all know good ultimately wins over evil, freedom wins over servitude, and justice wins over injustice. And I think that's why it touches all of us so much to the core, because what is happening is just so unjust. It was so unprovoked, and the war crimes that we witness, it's really grabbing people's souls and testing our values. And I know many people have difficulty, including myself, in many days, reconciling how can this never again be happening. It's like we are in the midst of that movie about the Second World War that we were watching, and it's happening and rolling out before our eyes.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to ask one more question, or would you like me to stop?
Well, Paula is asking her last question. If those who have written questions on their note cards can pass them to the center aisles, and if our readers can come and collect any that they see, we'll take them, and again, we'll get to as many as we can.
Okay. What will be needed to rebuild your country?
Massive effort, let me tell you that, because 1/3 of Ukrainian economy is destroyed by the official numbers, and the damages anywhere in the neighborhood between 600, I've seen the latest number, to $750 billion. So that's why it's so important to recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, because they have in the Federal Reserve, they seized about 500 billion of US assets, and those assets, reserves, could be transferred to Ukraine as repatriation to rebuild it. I think many countries are already talking about a Marshall Plan, the likelihood of what was done for Germany to rebuild Germany of the Second World War, for Ukraine. And of course, there will be lots of individual efforts, to go and help people come back home, get them jobs, get the infrastructure back. 60%, think about the numbers, 60% of Ukrainian infrastructure has been destroyed by those rockets that we're showering since October. So, and you're probably going to ask about my questions.
Yes.
How am I thinking about the, and I'm thinking about that already now. The best way, what I think, and I was thinking would be to do is always to give people, humanitarian aid is wonderful, helping kids and refugees is wonderful, but when you give people jobs, you give them the tools to find their livelihood again and to provide for themselves. So I was thinking possibly of doing like a fund that would provide financing to veterans, to people who fought in the war. And, just recently we had 5 soldiers without legs and some without arms just visit here. And they're young people. They're in their 20s and 21, and they're already without both legs. And, you see stuff like that, and it's just... But they say they're lucky because they're alive. Just imagine that. They're happy to be alive because so many are not. And so I think it will be a wonderful effort to go and offer people opportunities to start their businesses, to offer them jobs. And that's something that I look forward to when this horrendous war is over. And I'm really hoping that it's sooner than later. Before the more it drags on, the more will be the human toll.
Well, and you'll bring your incredible entrepreneurial spirit to that quest, and I do hope it starts soon. I'm happy to tackle this pile. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for asking questions. What other organizations in the Bay Area or California are doing particularly compelling humanitarian work in and beyond Ukraine?
There's a number. I think all the Ukrainian diasporas are sprung up, and all the organizations that were here, such as Razom for Ukraine, UACC, Nova Ukraine, Leleka. I also want to mention one organization that is not in California. It's a Ukrainian organization, but did tremendous work in the beginning. It's called, you can go to the site, Safe Life in Ukraine, because the Safe Life in Ukraine. Safe Life. In Ukrainian, Повернись живим. For Ukrainians, they probably know the organization. They were helping with protective military equipment. So all, Ukrainian organization that you want to give to, they all do tremendous work. I just want to draw one distinction. When you give to large organizations, because they get millions and millions in donations, it's just efficient and optimal for them to give these $1 million donation. For instance, buy medicine, charter planes. I know other organizations, they bought a lot of medicine, charter a plane, bring it to Ukraine. And then it sort of trickles down where you have smaller nonprofits, for example, like Romada or Jamie's organization that are local here in Marin, where we can help specific families, specific people who come to us. For example, I'll give you an example. We work with this volunteer in Ukraine, woman volunteer, and she really has a network. She knows the families where either the father has died or came back, committed suicide, or he died not in the compact, and they have multiple children, and they don't because of the way how the father died, they don't receive assistance from the state. And some of these women have 5, 6 children. And for them, to receive that $500, it's literally, it's life-changing. And you should see the notes that they write. So, we do these mini grants, right? And we, since the start of the war, we sent $435,000 in aid. And all of them in these, mini grants, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. Here's to orphanage. Here's to build an orphanage, do the repairs. Here's the furniture for the orphanage. Here's to provide medical equipment for the hospital. In these variety of ways. So to sum up your questions, lots of ways to contribute, lots of wonderful organizations to donate.
Great. Interesting question here. Why are some Ukrainians pro-Russian, especially in the Donbass?
Yeah, I think even if there were some pro-Russian Ukrainians, I think there are none now. Okay. After what has happened, after they have seen the horrors that Putin's Russia has brought onto them. It's really a phenomenon. You see that people refuse to speak Russian language. Eastern and central Ukraine, many Ukrainians spoke Russian because for so many years Ukraine was occupied and there was this policy of enforcing the Russian language, they do not want to speak that language anymore. It's almost like the pendulum is swinging in the other direction. In eastern Ukraine, for example, that they can tie down the statues of Pushkin, who lived in the 18th century, the Russian poet. So, it's... I think it's irrelevant questions. I think even if they were there, seeing the horrors, and all the horror and terror that Russian Federation is raining on Ukraine and how millions of people got impacted, I don't think there are any pro-Russians Ukrainian in Donbass.
Some folks in the audience want to know more about your staff in Ukraine and how your business has been impacted. I know you have staff in Mexico
I have staff.
and
We
Poland.
have people in Ukraine, and we helped other people, relocate, give them financial assistance. Things sort of now kind of settled. As human beings, we are so flexible. You put us in tough circumstances, and we grow tough skin, and we learn to live with it. So the same goes for my people, for my colleagues in Ukraine. You hear their stories sometimes, and it's, they hear the explosion and they are happy that they hear the explosion because they think that's the anti-defense system working properly, stuff like that. But, because the company is diversified, we have also operation in Latin America, and that helped us stay on float. Many of our clients, I have to say, none of our clients ditched us because we are developers of Ukraine. People recognized that there was a need to supporting people, to provide them jobs and their livelihoods. So, believe it or not, the client that we had, where the CEO, the client is in Chicago, and the CEO is of Ukrainian origin, and he helped us tremendously. He became our largest client this past year.
What role can women play in Ukraine in both a successful resolution and ongoing leadership? A critical role, I would say, leading role. And, there are very many women leaders in Ukraine that have emerged in this war, that take charge and do lots of things, whether it's in the military. I talk to those women who serve in the military. Think about their courage, that they are there on the front lines. Who gave up their jobs. They didn't have to do this, but they did this because they want to defend their country's sovereignty and freedom. There are so many women leadership in humanitarian organizations that I know that are doing, for example, Razum is headed up, the president is a Ukrainian American. She does tremendous work for Ukraine. And so, Ukrainian women have always been very strong, I have to say that. They take charge, they lead, and I see that, going forward, the women leaders are going to continue to contribute and help out and in the rebuilding efforts and humanitarian aid. I know this is going to be an emotional question for you, but do you think that Ukraine can negotiate with Russia on an end to the war?
And let me ask you, respond to that question with a question. Would you negotiate with Hitler? With someone who openly said that his goal in this war is to destroy Ukraine as a nation, to annihilate its territory? Is it possible to negotiate with someone who had openly said these things and have committed tens of thousands of war crimes? There are children here, so I want to speak about it, but when you read the records, it's all documented about the rapes of women, children, horrible torture that they do of the Ukrainian soldiers. How can you possibly negotiate? And, to give you an analogy, just imagine that a neighbor or somebody came to your house, took away a room, said, I'm going to live here now, raped your wife and your child, and they said, well, now let's negotiate, but I'm going to keep this room for myself, right? What would be your reaction? And the other thing is there's a very big danger. If you negotiate, it's 20% of Ukrainian territory that they have occupied. They'll take that. In a couple of years, they will gather their forces again, and they will go again, because I think Putin is staying on, he's saying, no, he wants to rule over Ukraine and occupy all Ukraine. He's not giving, even now, after all those failures, they're still stating those goals. So there has to be just peace for Ukraine, the peace that makes sense. And that just peace, it means getting them out of Ukraine. And nobody's going to go into the Russian territory. That's not what Ukrainians want. They just want their land, their country, their livelihood, their dignity back, because that is what is at attack.
Well, one last thing. What is maybe one more thing you haven't had a chance to share that you'd like to share with the audience in terms of what we walk away with, what we think about, what's in our
in
hearts?
your hearts? Well, I think I mentioned that already. I think I just want people really to understand the magnitude of this catastrophe. How many people affected? 2/3 of Ukrainian children had to move as a result of this war. Just think about it. 2/3 of Ukrainian children had been displaced. And I think hundreds of thousands were actually taken by Russians to Russia, kidnapped. The count of civilians already is in tens of thousands of people. And the soldiers, unfortunately, they wouldn't give us the exact numbers because, it's a part of the military signaling and strategy, but I've seen some estimates already in hundreds of thousands of people that have died as a result of this conflict. So it's, I think I said already, it's the greatest war that we probably, they're obviously going to go into history. We're going to look back on that time and think about it as, the biggest war that we lived in our lifetimes. We're going to talk about it, our children and women and grandchildren. And but the most important thing, I guess, to do is that each one of us can do something about it. If there's that drop, one drop here, one drop there, it eventually becomes a river. And it becomes a movement and becomes meaningful. And the most important things right now, as I said, is advocacy. Advocate, write to your representatives on those two important aspects, weapons and more isolation of Russia as state of terrorism. And then each one of us can do something in terms of humanitarian aid or just volunteering. And there are so many venues, right? And if you want to go and work with people who are local, there's Jamie, there's our organization, people who you trust, who are here local. There's always a way to help.
Great. Well, on that positive note, I'd like to say thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. And if I also want to thank the organizers, and I want to thank Lynn West. I want to thank Aaron Elliott. There is Karen Healthy somewhere there in the neighborhood, and of course you, Paula, because they've done all the groundwork of setting up this event and giving us this exposure, so opportunity to speak about such an important issue. So thank you very much. It's really a wonderful, community coming together and venue for these events. So my deep thanks to you.
You're very welcome, and we look forward to continuing the conversation for another half hour in the vestibule. So thank you.
One last thing. There was a question that asked, can a recording of this event be seen somewhere? And Paula wouldn't have known this, but just so that you will know, if you're interested, the recording will be on the Westminster Events YouTube, or the Westminster Church YouTube channel. So if you put in Westminster Presbyterian Church YouTube, you'll be able to find the recording of this event. And thank you all so much for coming. We're so pleased to have you here. And please do go enjoy the Ukrainian treats that our wonderful volunteers have provided for you out in America.
Thank you.